Hello guys, this is just one guy and I'm back here with another Unity tutorial. And if you've seen my last video, it was on how to do the Witcher 3's lock-on system. And in that one, I used a lot of colliders in a very basic version. But in this one, I'm going to upgrade it to version 2 and soon there will be coming a version 3. Now the first thing we're going to go over is how I interpret the Witcher 3 lock-on system to work. Now this is just from playing the games and looking at how the game works. Excuse me. Now, the way I've seen it that the game works, it has a way of getting specific targets, and then it has each target it gives a priority to. So the target with the most priority will be the enemy that hits you. Any enemy that hits the player will be the highest priority target, and when you get hit in the game, Geralt will basically turn around and face that enemy automatically, and that'll be the highest priority target. The second highest priority target, from what I observed, is the target in the cam view. So whatever the camera's looking at, that'll be the enemy that Geralt will point towards. That'll be the next highest priority target. The third highest priority target is the target that the player's attacking. So any enemy you directly hit, that'll be the next highest priority target. The next one after that is the closest enemy within a direction. So whatever direction Geralt's facing, that'll be the next highest priority target. And the last one would just be the target closest to the player. So based on that system right there, that's what this script is going to do. But specifically, it's not going to get the target hit by the player. The target the player has attacked or the target that hits the player. And that's because you would need to come up with a damaging system which will actually do that. I'm going to do that in part 3, but I've chosen not to do it here now because you might have your own damage system or your own system for attacking, and you would have to integrate that into that. You would have to integrate this system into that instead of me writing my own, which I'll do it in version 3. Now let's just go over the script and see how it works. The first thing we have here is the track enemies variable. And the track enemies variable is just this script right here. The reason we set it as a static script so we can access this script from anywhere in the game. And the reason for this is this script just gives you a target. It doesn't lock on to the enemy. You might want to write that in here, but the way I've chosen to do it, I didn't write it in here. And I needed to access this script from another script. And since there's only ever going to be one of these scripts, because it's the player, unless you have your own game in which you have to change this right here. But with me, there's only ever going to be one of these scripts because of the player. So since there's only ever going to be one, I set it up as a static variable. That way I can just access it without needing a direct reference to the script. Excuse me. Next we have all enemies. This is going to be all enemies in the game. Now, normally I would put this in the game manager and I would just set it up as all enemies, but just to make everything a bit simpler and to make this a bit more complete so you can just download it and use it right away, I put all enemies here. Now all enemies is going to be all enemies in the game. Now at the beginning of the game, you're going to want to set all the enemies in your level or your game in this variable right here, and that'll hold all the enemies. Now the rest of these lists right here, enemies near, enemies in cam, enemies in front of player, they all get their enemies from all enemies right here. And this has a couple of benefits. For one, you're not doing GameObject.search or anything like that, or GameObject.find by tag, and it just avoids a lot of that. Now if you're creating enemies at runtime, what you're going to want to do is add them to this list, and then based on how they get destroyed, remove them from the list. But that's beyond the scope of this tutorial, just to keep things simple, so I'm not explaining extra things, making the video longer. I'm just going to say put all the enemies into this all enemy script, and however you do it, it's just however you do it. Next we have the enemies near. This is going to be all the enemies near the player. Now what determines how far an enemy can be before they're detected and put on this list is the near distance right here. So any enemies within this distance right here will be on this list right here. Next we have the enemies in cam. These are all the enemies that are going to be visible on camera, but it's going to be deriving from the enemies near list. So the way it works is it's going to be all the enemies within this distance right here that are on the camera. So it won't detect any enemies, well, basically beyond this distance. And that's going to be true for every one of these lists right here. Next, we have all enemies and players. All enemies in front of the player, excuse me. This is going to be all the enemies that are directly in the line of sight of the player. Now, if the enemy's in front of you, it'll detect it and it'll put it on this list. Of course, within this distance right here. Next, we have the enemy near. Now, after we get all the enemies that are close to the player, we want the specific enemy that's closest to the player. And that's going to be the enemy near right here. And next, we have the enemy in cam. The same thing with this list. The closest enemy within the view of the camera. That's going to be this right here. Next, we have the enemy in front. This is going to be the closest enemy that's in front of the player, that's in the line of the sight of the player. And of course, they're all going to be limited by this distance right here. Next, we have the player, which is self-explanatory, the player of the game. Then we have targets. Now, these are used to sort which target we want to lock onto. As I said before, the script is not going to cover getting the target that that hits the enemy that hits the player, or target or enemy that the player has attacked. But I left it in here just in case you want to add that into your game yourself, and just to show you how the system works completely. But I will be going over that in version 3. Now, the first target we have is the target hit by player. The next target is the target within the cam view. The third target is the target the player has attacked. The fourth target is the closest enemy within in front of the player. The last target is the closest enemy near the player. Now, next we have awake. The awake is called before start. It's the first thing called. I believe after on enable or before on enable, but whichever one it is, this will be the first thing called. This will be called before start or anything else. So we put track enemy equals this, and that's basically saying that this static variable right here equals this script right here. That way we can access it from anywhere else in the game, any other script. Next, we have the fix update, which I'm going to go over last because it just calls all the functions that are down below it. The first function we have is the find closest target, and you should be familiar with this this function right here. If you're not, this tutorial is going to be too complex for you, and you need to find simpler tutorials to go over before you try to do this one. But you can always just copy the scripts from the link that I'll leave down below and use it that way. But this is a pretty basic script. Now, we should all be familiar with this. The only difference between this one and the way it's written and a unit example is the parameter it takes is a list. So it takes a parameter, which is a list, and if the enemy count is 0, it just returns. That way you don't get any errors. Next, it just goes through a list of enemies, whichever list you put into this parameter right here, and then it goes through them, find the closest one, and then return the closest one. And it's pretty basic. Next, we have find the enemy in front of and skipped one. We have the find the enemy nearest to the player. Now, the reason this is different because we want to add enemies to the list, enemies near, and then we want to find the closest enemy. And we want to add enemies to the enemies near list because these two lists right here are going to derive from whatever this list finds. Now, first we have the basic position, which is the player's position. Next, we go through the list of all enemies, which is all enemies in the game. And we find the ones that are closest to the player by direction, blah, blah, blah. This gets the direction. And then we come to the first thing I've added, which is if the enemy count equals 0. Now, if enemies near equals 0, we don't need to do anything else. We just need to add the enemy to the list, and that's all it's going to do. Now, if there's already enemies on a list, we have to check if the enemy we want to add is already on a list. Now, you don't want to add the enemy you've already added to the list because that'll give you doubles and create useless calculations. It would also crash your game eventually because you would just be going through a list of 50 to 50 billion trillion enemies or whatever. So this just gets the enemy, it just checks, it says, hey, is that enemy we want to add to the list already on the list? And if it is, it does nothing. If it's not, it adds it to the list. And next down here, we go through the list again. We say, hey, if the enemy count is 0, do nothing, because we don't need to do anything. And this code right here just removes it from the list in case we need to do something. Now, how we remove an enemy from the list is we go through the list again, and then we check the distance. Since the parameter for removing the enemy from the list is that the enemy is beyond the distance that we want it, we check the distance, and if the enemy is beyond the distance that we set, we remove it from the list. So this code right here will add enemies to the list up here, and it won't add devils, and then this one will remove it from the list based on direction. Not direction, distance, and that distance will be whatever we set up right here. And at the end of the code, it'll just say the enemy that's closest to the player equal, we run it through the find closest target script function, which we set up right here. And the variable enemy near will equal the enemy that's nearest to us. And you can see how that works. Next, we go into the function find enemies in front of player. It basically does what it says. It finds all the enemies that are in the line of sight of the player. Now the first thing we do is go through the enemies near list. We go through the enemies near list because those are already the enemies that are near the player within the distance that we set for the player. That way we're not going through extra calculations and checking enemies that are way far away from the player that we don't want to lock onto. Now this code right here, it gets the direction of the enemy, and I'm just going to go to the internet real quick and show you what I mean. I went over this before in a previous video, but just so you have everything right here, I'm going to show you exactly what it's doing. So let's just okay, and we're back here. This will help me describe what the function is doing better. I've explained this in a previous video when I said how to get an enemy's direction, but I'm just going to explain it here. Now pretend this is the player, and this are all the degrees around the player. It goes from 0 to 360. I know it says 350 right here, but right before 0 will be 360. And when you get the circle, all the enemies are going to be one of these points right here. And that's what the function is going to give you. So if an enemy is right here, they'll be at 50 degrees this way right here. If an enemy is directly in back of you, no, this will be forward right here, and this would be in back of you. So if an enemy is directly in back of you, they'll be at 180. Side of you, 90. Other side of you, 270. And that's how you get the enemy's direction. You basically make the player this right here, and then all these degrees around here will show you where the player's at. It doesn't matter if they're up or down or anything like that, because all you're doing is getting them in a circle like this. And that's basically what that function is doing. Now let's just go back into the script so I can explain everything else. Now we're back in the script, and you can understand what this code does right here, which gets the side angle and basically returns the the direction of the player. Now, as I said before, this gets the direction directly in front of the player of all enemies that are directly in front of the player, which is less than 90 degrees but above 0 degrees, or below 270 degrees. Now that will determine if the enemy is in front of the player. So basically, if the enemy is in front of the player, then we check if the enemy is already on the list. If the enemy is already on the list being enemies in front of the player, we don't do anything. But if the enemy is not already on the list, then we add them to the list. And of course, if the enemy is not in front of the player, then we just remove it from the list. Now down here we go and we say, hey, if there are no if the enemies in front of the player list equals 0, then don't do anything because we don't want to get any errors. But if it doesn't equal 0, then we find the closest enemy in front of the player and to return it to the variable enemy in front, and that'll be the closest enemy in front of the player. We just feed that list that we just created right here into the find closest target function, and that'll give us the variable that'll return variable of the closest enemy in front of the player. And that's how that function works. Just do. Next, we have to find the enemy, find the closest enemy, well, find enemies in the camp view. And this will add enemies to the list based on whether they're in a view of the camera or not. So first thing we do is if enemies near counting 0, we just return because we don't want to get any errors. And there's nothing, if there's nothing on the enemy near list, then there's no enemies near the player, so we don't need to do anything. Now, if it does have enemies on the enemy near list, which is the list of enemies near the player, then we go through the list and we find the skin mesh. We go through every enemy near the player and we find the skin mesh renderer. Now that's the renderer for any object that's animated. So basically any humanoid or monster object, which is how we find it. And it'll just go through it and find a mesh and it'll say, hey, is that visible? And what is visible means is the camera able to see it. Now, in my game, the one I created, and just for simplicity's sake, I left it this way. It just gets every other mesh other than the player, because of course the player is the person, well, doing the search. But if you needed a bit more control, then I would write something like and tag equals enemy, and that would just find all of the enemies visible on camera that'll tag enemy, or whatever parameter you determine, whatever parameter you use to determine enemies. Now basically if it finds a person that's visible on the camera, it'll go it'll add them to the list. Well, it'll check the list first to see if they're on the list already, and if they're on the list already, it'll do nothing else. It'll add them to the list, which is basically the same as before. And of course, if they're not on camera, it'll just remove them. Then we go down here and we basically do the same thing as before, and we add the target. We rerun the whole list through the find closest target function, and it'll return the enemy and cam, which we assign to the enemy and cam variable. Last, we have choose the soft target. Now this is only going to deal with targets 2, 4, and 5, because targets 2, 4, and 5 are the one in the camera view, the one in front of the player, and the one nearest. We're not going to deal with the one that the player attacks and the one where the enemy attacks the player, which will be 1 and 3. And this basically just says, hey, if we have a target that hit the player, then the main target equals that target. And if we don't, it'll go to target 2. Target 2 will be the enemy in cam. So if we don't have a target, if we don't have an enemy that hit the player, go for the target that's in the cam view. If we don't have a target that's in the cam view, then go for the target that the player is attacking. If we don't have a target that the player is attacking, go for the target that's in front of the player, that's directly in front of the player. If we don't have the target that's directly in front of the player, go after the one that's closest to the player. And that's how that works, which is how it determines the main target. And at the end, you'll have a target if there are any targets near the player, and that'll be our main target. And that's it for how this script works. It's pretty simple, but it deals with some complex ideas that I was learning over the past few weeks. If you watched all my videos, you'll be able to do this. Well, you could have put this together yourself, but it's nice to have it all in one video. Now I'll create a link in the bottom of the description, well, in the description, that'll hopefully link you to the script, but this script might be too long. So just in case, I'll slowly go through this so you can copy it, just in case it won't let me put a link to the script or anything like that. Because normally I post all these scripts on Pastebin, but sometimes if the script is too long, it won't let you do that. So just in case, I'll go through this slowly so you can copy it now. that's it for today. Thank you for watching. And remember, there will be a part 3 to this where I'll put in the last 2 targets, which will be the target that'll attack the enemy. A target that attacked the player, and the enemy that attacked the player, and the player that attacked the enemy. So that's it for today. Thank you for watching.